It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Well, welcome back to your feel-good breakfast show, and we have a very special guest in studio this morning. And you might recognize Tracy Going as the TV presenter, always ready to kickstart your mornings. But behind closed doors, what had started off as a fairy tale romance quickly descended into a violent, abusive relationship. She takes us through her journey in her memoir, Brutal Legacy, which has recently been adapted into a play.
There we go, and we can't wait to see some snippets from the play. We're going to be showing you a little bit later on. This is the book. Tracy, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Lovely to have you, and I do hope that your story this morning will inspire, I think, a lot of women out there. Thank you very much for telling your story, first and foremost. So we've, of course, become accustomed to seeing you on TV, glamorous, all made up.
A long time ago,
of course. I mean, we're talking about the 1990s, you know, in there as well.
Right.
So it came as a surprise when we saw a bruised face pop up. And, you know, what led you to telling your story? What was the motivation behind it? Because it is a very difficult thing to talk about, I'm sure.
I think I've always... there's a part of me that's always wanted to tell the story because I feel that I think silence is its own brutality. So that was always a big thing for me. But the thing was, do you really want to tell your story? Because what happens when you tell a story like this is that people look at you differently. So but having come from the media, you know, I understand the price of being sort of publicly out there. So I think it was really when Oscar murdered Reva, and I just felt that enormous outrage, and we as South Africans watched the court case play out on, you know, on TV. And I think it was then that the court case came back into my life, and I sort of relived my own trials through that case. And then, of course, when he was sentenced, it was an outrage to every single woman in this country. And that was when I decided, now I'm going to tell my story. I want to give insight into what happens in a home of domestic violence, and then, of course, to find yourself caught up in a relationship with domestic violence.
And I think that's important for a lot of ladies to read and be exposed to in terms of, you know, the literature that's out there. But Tracy, the backdrop of your book, I mean, it's riddled. Well, you was talking a lot about the violence that, you know, forms the backdrop of your book. Did this help you identify your abuser?
Well, I certainly knew who the abuser was. I think what people very often ask me was, has it been cathartic? And I'm always fascinated by that question, you know, has it brought some healing for you? And I think that is the very first step in healing, is telling our stories, although I had told my story a lot over the years. But even writing it, yes, I did find it to be an enormously healing process. And just to go back to what you say, you know, you say this is for women, but I think that what I'm most surprised by is the response by men, is that so many men have grown up in homes of domestic violence. And then very often the victim either becomes a perpetrator or you know, they've been helpless children in an environment where they weren't able to do anything. So the response from men has been particularly overwhelming.
And I'm sure it must have been amazing to see the response from women and men alike with regards to what you've written in terms of your own life story. I need to ask you, though, taking a look at your professional career, being in the media as well, public eye constantly on you as well, what effect did this painful part of your history have on your career thereafter, once you've broken the news, once you came out with the book?
Oh, it was brutal. At that time I was doing, I think I was presenting about 3 TV shows and was on radio every day. And it certainly brought my career to an absolute dead standstill at the time. You know, nobody wanted to touch you because the defense will do whatever they can and tell whatever story they can to keep themselves out of jail or out of trouble or whatever. And it didn't matter what they did to me. And of course, the effect of it was very instant. And it took about 2 years. A year into the trial, he skipped the country and ran away. And it took a year for the police to find him. And it was when he was found again and he changed his plea to guilty, which was then that suddenly everybody rallied behind me and could be seen to publicly be rallying behind me. And then that's when things all sort of came right, I suppose.
Sure.
Well, I know that there's, everyone has their own advice that they always give, but I feel like you need to share, you know, for anyone potentially watching this morning that feels like they're kind of helpless right now, what advice would you give them?
I think the very first thing is safety, and I think the victim is the one who understands how dangerous or how unsafe a situation is at any given point. And I think that that is your first priority, is to make yourself safe. Now, whether it means you leave or whether it means you stay and try and diffuse the situation, only you would know best, or only you can leave when you're ready. But I think that is the very first priority, is getting yourself safe.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, more so getting that conversation started. And I think your book did a lot in terms of, you know, helping women to be able to talk about it as well. Just reading, because I think a lot of times when women and men in that situation, you feel alone, you feel isolated, but there's so much of it going around as well, and we need to be talking about it. And I'm glad that we are talking more and more about it. We have you here for a little while longer. We're going to continue chatting about your journey. Now, just when you thought the words of Tracy Going's book couldn't harness any more power, her story is being brought to life at the Auto and General Theatre on the Square in Sandton City, Johannesburg, directed by Lesedi Job, starring Natasha Sutherland and also Charlie Bourgeon. You can catch the jaw-dropping play until the 27th of April, and this is what you can expect.
Many of us will remember former radio and television presenter Tracy Going bringing us the latest news on the radio and television in the 90s. And although she's no longer in the broadcasting space, she's still busy with various projects in the industry, the latest being a theatre production, Brutal Legacy, which is based on her memoir.
What started off as a fairy tale romance with a man who appeared to be everything that Tracy was looking for, charming, handsome, successful, soon descended into a violent, abusive relationship.
Tracy, the memoir that you wrote talks about a very dark time in your life. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Well, I've written it from the perspective of a child that grew up in a home of domestic violence, and then I've written it as a woman who thought it would never happen to her, and it did. So it's my story of really giving insight into what happens in a home of domestic violence and how it all plays out and really how it affects you. And the long-term effects of it, I mean, 20 years to find the courage to actually tell my story. I've always felt that I should tell it for the very reason of giving insight, but also knowing that people look at you differently. So I think probably that's what held me back for quite a few years. And I also had to get some distance between my story from what happened and being able to tell it and not being bitter about anything, because nobody wants to read a story of bitterness.
Women abuse in South Africa has reached such levels that a group of influential women, directed by award-winning theatre maker Lesedi Job, are using Tracy's story to shake things up.
Abuse is such a sensitive story, especially seeing that it's someone's story that you now know personally. How did you go about getting the story up on its feet?
The first thing I did was to read the book over and over and over again and almost get the understanding behind who Tracy Going is. Because before you can portray a character, you need to understand who they are. I then got Natasha Sutherland to adapt it into a script. And I remember I said, Natasha, these are the 3 aspects within the book that I've picked up that I think we can put on stage and tell the story.
So I think this is an important thing to come to theatre. It is a topic that needs to be discussed. I think it is way more infiltrated into the fabric of our society than what we realise. And this theatre is intended to be a mirror to society. And so we need to reflect society back at itself so that it can think and ponder and reflect and change.
The process has been tough because also Tracy Going is a person that is still here, and so it's been confronting in many ways because we're telling somebody's story, but also we're doing it for a reason. You know, there's a purpose behind it, and it's not just, you know, it's not just a show. It speaks to South Africa, to the families in South Africa. The content is difficult, but it's a very important story.
How do you want people to feel when they watch this production?
In an audience, they need to be completely disturbed by violence against women so that it can stop. I also think the most beautiful thing about the story is looking at Tracy today and seeing a survivor. I think wanting people who have gone through whatever it is that they've gone through in life to know that they can make it on the other side. If you don't always stay being a victim.
How did the decision to bring your story to the theatre, to bring it to life, come about?
Well, that had nothing to do with me. That was Lesedi Job, the director, actually coming and approaching my publisher firstly. It was really all Lesedi, and I can't take any credit for that. When I wrote the book, and I tried to be as visual as possible because I wanted to take the reader on the journey with me visually, to not just tell the story, but for people to feel the story, to feel the anxiety, to feel the shame, to feel the fear. So I tried to be as colourful as possible in actually writing the story, hoping that maybe one day it might even become a play.
Running at Santon's Auto and General Theatre on the Square, starring Natasha Sutherland, Charlie Bougenon and Jessica Volhutter, Brutal Legacy is a must-see.
Brutal Legacy is such a brilliant example of turning adversity into an inspiring story that will hopefully help so many other people out there. Kudos to Tracy for being so generous with her story, and of course to the cast and crew for doing it justice.
Well, there you have it, a sneak peek of the Tracy Going's memoir, Brutal Legacy, being adapted into a play. And for those of you just joining us now, former TV and news anchor Tracy Going was one of the most loved faces and TV personalities. And if you think back to the 1990s, and although she has stepped out of the limelight after being in an abusive relationship that played out in the media, she's using her story to raise awareness around the issue of gender-based violence with the play titled Brutal Legacy, which is an adaptation of her memoir. And she's joining us here this morning again, and she joins the likes of, Riva Steenkap, Jade Peniatu. I'm looking at names here of Susan Rueda, Karabo Mokoena, and those are many of the unspoken, just some of the unspoken voices and faces of South Africa. And what sets Tracy apart is she's one of the few that made it out alive. And we're here to talk to you today to unpack the play a little bit more, and of course to get some advice from you.
It's powerful. Tracy, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on the play. I'm sure that it's going to speak, to have that visual element as well for people on stage portraying, your life story and what you went through. I think it's fantastic. So this is the book, Brutal Legacy. Go out if you haven't gotten it yet. Please go read it as well. It will definitely serve as very, very helpful inspiration as well if you find yourself maybe in a similar situation as well. So Tracy, you've documented your journey in an effort to highlight these issues surrounding women abuse. Do you think after so many years, after telling your story, taking a look at today's day and age, is there enough support towards women in abusive relationships?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think there'll never be enough support. But I think women, or any victim, I don't want to even just say only women, but any victim who finds themselves in a really dangerous abusive situation, there are people very close to them who probably want to help as well. People are ashamed, and that's what keeps them quiet. They don't want their neighbours or their family to know about it. So, but the help is there. There are people who would take you in if you needed to get out with the kids or whatever the situation may be. So aside from there being organisations and shelters and, places like Women Remaining Against Child Abuse or Power or various organisations, you can probably turn to the people closest to you.
We currently have the Stop Gender Violence helpline on our screen right now. That number's there for you. And Tracy, I think when it comes to the symptoms or the signs to look out for, if I can call it that, the symptoms, often the person in the situation don't always see it, but what do you do as a bystander when you witness the telltale signs? How do you intervene? Is it even possible for an outsider to step in?
Yeah, I think it's very, very difficult. And I also would just like to say that I am not an authority on domestic violence. So I'm always very cautious about getting advice. But, and you very often hear stories, when people do get involved, they get sort of chased out of the situation very, very quickly. It's probably best to get professional help. To get someone who knows how to assist you, because you also don't want to disempower someone who is already disempowered.
And but I think what's powerful here is the fact that you have that first-hand experience and you can speak from experience. Just quickly, in terms of your other relationships, after something like this, maybe this can serve as also inspiration for people that's been through a similar journey. How did this affect your relationship with people around you in terms of you accepting love again and trusting?
Well, trusting is the big thing, but I think the one thing, in fact, it wasn't about trusting other people, it was about trusting my gut instinct. Because Zoe, you spoke about the warning signs. The red flags are always there, and we dismiss it. We think, oh, well, it's not really so bad, or I can manage it, or it might get better. It wouldn't really happen to me. I know that's the way I thought a lot of the time. I thought, oh, this can't be happening to me. you know, I mean, for goodness sake. So the red flags are certainly there, and one needs to listen to your inner voice. So I needed to learn to trust myself again and to trust my inner voice.
Sure, and what a journey. Before we wrap up, is there any chance that we're going to see you back on the telly, on the radio lines? Anything, Tracy?
Who knows what happens?
Who knows what happens? Watch this space. Just once again, if you have missed it, that Stop Gender Violence helpline, you can call 0800 150 150. That's 0800 150 150 for help. And Tracy, thank you so much for joining us this morning and being able to talk so openly and freely about your own experience. Brutal Legacy, this is the book. Go get it, and also catch Brutal Legacy. The play is definitely going to be something not to miss.
And you can catch it until the 27th of April at the Auto and General Theatre in Sandton.